Welcome in to the fantasypoints.com live stream here at fantasypoints.com. Greg, I hope the new intro didn't scare you. Man,
God, I did, it said I was in the show. Everyone can see and hear me. I was getting ready to pick my nose. I figured I wouldn't do that.
Well, we got the big music here counting us down, but it's good to be with you. I'm Joe Dolan. That's Greg Cosell. Y'all know Greg very well. He is the legend, host of the NFL matchup show on ESPN. And Greg, this is an interesting time of year for you because, look, we're transitioning players to the NFL. And at fantasypoints.com, this is the third year we're doing this. We are publishing all your evaluations as part of our prospect guide up at fantasypoints.com. And it's something that you, and I mean, I'll let you tell the story, you had been kind of doing for yourself. And now the people get to see your evaluations. It's $25 at fantasypoints.com. We are putting the finishing touches on that today. It will be out today, but you can pre-order it, and then we'll blast social, email, and everything. We are going to launch with over 80 players, but it will be constantly updated throughout the month of April with Greg's evaluations. Because Greg, you said this to me quite a bit last year. You said it to me again. You are a one-man scouting service. Yeah. You are watching and charting these players all yourself. And I want to talk about that process before we get into some specific players, because you don't have the luxury. And not to say, like, there are plenty of great people who do this year round as you're a draft expert, you're a draft guru. You don't have that luxury. You're doing the NFL matchup show. You watch NFL film all year long, and then once the calendar turns to the new year, it starts to kind of become draft season for you.
Right.
So let's tell people just kind of what your process is and when you start really evaluating the prospects for the upcoming draft.
Well, the way it works for me, Joe, is because of matchup from basically beginning of August, maybe even toward the end of July, until mid-January, late January, just before the Super Bowl, my focus is 100% on watching NFL coaching tape because that's required and demanded, and that's the way I work for the NFL matchup show. So I'm really heavily into NFL coaching tape. As you know, I watch as many games as I can, as many teams as I can. I can't watch 16 games every week. It's not humanly possible, but I do the best that I can with that. So then during the summer, and I get 5 weeks vacation here at NFL Films. And very often, if I don't go anywhere, which has been the case for the last number of years, I will spend that time starting to watch college players who I know will be in the draft the next year. Now, there's always a few that end up staying in college, but that's okay. But I try to get maybe 60 or 70 guys preliminarily done over the summer, so at least I have a foundation and a starting point for who they are. Because for the most part, Joe, guys don't change in terms of their athletic and physical traits in a meaningful way. When I say athletic and physical traits, I mean, can a guy gain a few more pounds? Sure. But a guy is not going to be a bad athlete in the summer and a great athlete, during the season. That's not going to happen. So I get a feel for 60 to 70 guys. And then starting mid-January, as the NFL season is winding down, that's when I really start digging in to the college tape. And because I have access to the college coaching tape at NFL Films, I watch full games. I'm not watching YouTube highlights. I'm not trying to scrounge around to get film or tape. I have the tape. So there's most positions you have to watch full games to get a total feel for a player. Yeah. I know a lot of people might think, oh, I can watch 30 plays. Hey, more power to them. I can't work that way. If I'm going to watch a defensive player, I have to watch games. Now, I don't watch all 13 or 14 games. Again, not humanly possible. And you don't need to watch 13 or 14 games. But I always feel with a defensive player that I have to watch at least 3 games. Usually I watch more, but that's the way I go about it. And it takes time. That's why I'm glad you said what you said. I've been grinding away. I think I've worked 7 days a week since mid-August. So it's when the draft ends, then I'll finally breathe.
Yeah, for sure. And like, here's the thing that we need to know about this prospect guy, because we're going to launch with 80 plus players. Right. By the end of last year's prospect guide, which I'm sure was also an extra challenge for you with the COVID shortened college football season, we had over 150 players. So this thing is going to be populated through. And
we'll have that again this year, Joe.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. But I mean, that's something for the people to look forward to. But I wanted to catch on to something that you said. You said you can't just watch 30 to 40 plays of like a defensive player. Now, if you have a talented eye, Greg, and you do, and many people in this space do, you can probably watch 30 to 40 plays of a guy and at least get an idea of what his physical traits are.
Sure.
But when you're watching a player, and this is what's important about Greg's scouting reports, and this is the next section that I want to get into, and this is why I love these scouting reports. In your scouting reports, you have basically a strengths section, a weakness section, and a notes section.
Well, everybody in the section.
Right. Everybody in the industry does those three things. But the transition section, which is kind of like what we have at the bottom, it's a big paragraph. It's kind of your summary of a player. And this is where I want people to focus when you read our prospect guide. Because you are watching NFL film most of the year, you are looking at these guys and their skill sets, and you are immediately not saying, oh, this guy's fast, which you are. I mean, you are. You're saying he's fast, he's explosive, he's not that fast, he's not that explosive. But you're looking at him through the lens of where does he fit in an NFL offense, in an NFL defense. And from our perspective, we're a fantasy site first and foremost. We want to know where these guys are going to fit and play in an NFL system. So is that always the first thought you have when you're watching a college prospect?
It's close. I mean, look, there's two parts to watching college players. There's obviously evaluating the player, meaning traits, attributes, characteristics. You do start there. Mm-hmm. But then once you feel that, well, then there's a second part to that, by the way. There's how they're deployed by their college team, because that very often tells you a lot of things. And I'll give you a very good example of that. And we'll get into more detail, and people can read this particular report. This one is out already. Jordan Davis, okay? Jordan Davis, and this is why you have to watch games. Jordan Davis did not play on third down. Now, if Kirby Smart is not going to play Jordan Davis on third down, no matter how freakishly gifted he may be at 6'6", 340 pounds, that tells you something. So if you're going to look at Jordan Davis and say, wow, this guy is so freakish, he's a top 10 pick. Well, who knows where he'll get drafted, Joe, obviously. But then you have to think to yourself, if Kirby Smart's not playing him on third down, is Bill Belichick going to play him on third down? Yeah, probably not. So now that factors into how you transition and project players to the league. So there's two parts to the initial part to get to what you asked me. There's the traits, attributes, and characteristics. Then there's how they're deployed in college. And then what does that mean for how they could be deployed in the NFL? Because there's very few transcendent players, Joe, that can do everything. There's not a lot of those guys. You know, in fact, if you talk to teams, they'll tell you that every year there's probably only 15 players that get a first-round grade from teams, but yet there's 32 first-round picks. So therefore, teams are making these same kinds of judgments, and teams are looking at it much more in a vacuum than I am. They're thinking of how does that help my team? They're not thinking about other teams. They're thinking, how does that help my team? I'm trying to think in a more 30,000-foot overview of how does a guy fit into the league? You know, if it's a safety, can he play in the box? Can he cover tight ends man to man? Can he play post safety as the single high safety with the range and play speed required? You have to think about these things when you watch players. Most people who do this, and there's a lot of really, really good ones who do this and watch college tape, most of us can see that a guy, he's, as you said, he runs well, or he can flip his hips. You know, most of us can see that pretty quickly. But for instance, I'm watching Trent McDuffie, the corner from Washington, who some say might be a first-round pick and whose tape, by the way, up to this point I like. And all of a sudden I'm watching the tape and I see in a sub defense, he's a stacked linebacker. Now, you have to watch the games to know that. If you just watch some highlights, you might not see that.
Right. They're not going to put that on a highlight, unless he makes.
No, because he didn't make the play.
Right. Right.
So you're not going to see that.
So, but the Washington trusted him to do that, and Greg, the whole thing about first round grades, and I think certainly there's going to be years where the draft is deeper, and maybe a team that typically would have 18 first round grades might have 20 in a particular year. But I think that's always something I look at when a team trades up and down, because look, I understand how fans react. Oh my God, how could you let our rival get this guy? Why did you trade back? Well, let's talk about a player you and I chatted a little bit off screen about, Lewis Seen, the safety from Georgia.
Yep.
Now, there might be 15 teams in the NFL who have a first round grade on him, and the other half of the teams don't have a first round grade on him because he's a specific type of player.
Yep.
And that's always something that goes through my mind when a team makes a trade to trade up or trade down in the NFL draft. Like, for instance, if you see a team trade up into the back end of the first round of the NFL draft, that is a spectacular sign that there is a player who had a first round grade on their board who has fallen a little bit further than they anticipated.
Right.
So, just because there's 32 picks, there's not 32 first round grades on every draft board.
No, and one position that's obviously a really critical position, Joe, for fantasy is receiver. Okay. And receiver is a position, as people always ask me to make lists. Oh, who's your top this? Who's your top 5? Who's your top 10? And receiver is a position that's very difficult for me to even consider doing that, because receivers are so different based on size, length, build, traits. And then teams in the NFL, what kind of receiver are they looking for based on what they have? A team might say, hey, you know what? We've got the speed guy. We're really looking for the big physical X receiver that can line up and win one-on-one to the boundary. Another team might say, we've got that guy. We'd really like some speed. So it's very hard to make a list of receivers. You have to see it based on what teams want,
right,
and what they might be looking for. I mean, you look at the Miami Dolphins right now. I'd say they've got a little speed, wouldn't you, Joe? With Waddle and Hill,
I would think so.
I don't know what they're going to do with Devontae Parker. None of us know that. But let's say Devontae Parker's not there, just for the sake of this discussion. They might say, you know what? We need a big physical wideout, because we've got two guys that are under 5'11" that can run like the wind. But you know what? Maybe when it's 3rd and 5 and we want to throw a contested catch to gain 7 yards, we might like to get that guy. Yeah. So therefore, they might have a certain guy higher on their board than Jahan Dotson, even though I may like Jahan Dotson just in a vacuum more than that other receiver. So, there's so many factors that go into play here.
And let's talk about that wide receiver in terms of like the ideal. Very rarely does a Calvin Johnson come available.
Yes.
Where like you, Greg, I'm sure when Calvin Johnson came out, you were like, this guy's the best receiver in the draft and he would fit anywhere.
Yeah,
that's not necessarily the case this season.
Yeah, and I think that, as I said a moment ago about most positions, there's very few transcendent players. Look, to me, and maybe some disagree, and that's fine. I like to think that reasonable people can disagree without it being a problem. But I don't see a Jamar Chase in this draft.
Yeah.
So to me, there's not that one receiver that you say, oh, he's everything. That's the guy you have to go get. It doesn't matter the offense. It doesn't matter what you ask him to do. It doesn't matter where you want to line him up. He's that guy.
And I want to continue this conversation because we're going to talk receivers in a later week. Greg's going to come on throughout the month of April as well to talk about the fantasy relevant positions. That's what we're going to do. And I want to talk today. We're going to just talk about Greg's. I would like to consider it your specialty. I'm sure you consider it your specialty, the quarterback position. And you sent me what I would think, and we're going to launch with this, what I would think would be the consensus, like kind of top 6 quarterbacks in this draft class.
Right.
And I think I don't think anybody is going to be taken by surprise by the names that are going to be launching with the draft guide. You might send me one or two later, but
yeah, well, I've started to look at Bailey Zappi. I'm going to look at Chase Garbers because some people have said to me he's someone I should take a peek at. So, yeah, those two will be part of it as well. Actually, I'm going to look at the kid from God, now I can't remember his name. He was Sky Moore's quarterback.
At Western Michigan, Caleb Ellaby.
Yes. I've done some work on him already because obviously I did Sky Moore in detail. So I'll finish up, so there'll be at least 3 more quarterbacks, before this process is over.
But I think these are the guys who, when you talk about, hey, I know this guy's going to be in the draft next year, the quarterbacks are kind of the ones who you're more familiar with these guys from like even a year or two ago. And I want to start with a guy who I think is getting a lot of hype. I've heard some buzz, I don't know if it's true or not, that if you want him, you better get into the top 5, and that's Malik Willis out of Liberty. And this is the thing where the transition, I think, Greg, is so fascinating.
Yep.
And it's so and honestly, at times it's almost an unanswerable question. And there's probably going to be 10 to 15 scouts, decision makers around around a table saying 7 of them are saying, yes, he can make this transition. 3 of them might say he can't. But the one thing that's evident about Malik Willis, you saw it at the pro day, okay? The guy's talent, his physical attributes do jump off the page. The question now becomes, what can Malik Willis do at the NFL level? And this is simply a true evaluation because there were some things in his offense that he was not asked to do at the collegiate level.
Correct. And, that gets into a broader discussion of what would be considered high-level traits to play quarterback in the NFL. If I ask this of you, and again, you and I are not coaches, obviously, I spend more time talking to coaches, I would imagine, than you do, and I've been doing that for a long time. And I was very fortunate to really learn the quarterback position from Bill Walsh. So when I look at a quarterback, I'm thinking about how to play it to perfection. Obviously, very few play it to perfection, but theoretically, that's the way it's coached and taught, with the goal of playing it at a high level, snap after snap after snap. So if I said to you, tell me the traits that in your mind, and this is rhetorical, we're not going to get into a lengthy discussion about this, but if I were to say that to you, tell me the traits that in your mind are really necessary in some kind of order to play quarterback at a high level in the NFL, what would you say? My guess is the 2 traits that I'm about to mention would not be high, really high on someone's list. Throwing the ball really hard and running fast. Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think like those are the trait. When people say he's a traits guy,
right?
Those are the things. And Malik Willis does those things. That's when you're
I stood next to Malik Willis throwing a football. I was at an event last summer and he was there. And to use the term someone said to me, which is a great term, he's got a hand cannon without question. Okay. And he can run fast. So if that's what people mean when they say that he's got high level traits, they need to say that, because those 2 traits are not really high level traits relative to playing quarterback at a high level in the NFL.
Right.
Now, can they be? They can be. They absolutely can be. But that in and of itself does not make for traits that would lead to necessarily playing at a high level. And again, he ran an offense, and I have, Matt Bowen, who's on the matchup show with me, he also coaches high school football in the Chicago area. And when he watched the tape of Liberty, and he watched it after I did, he said to me that we do more things with our passing game than Liberty did. Now, you can't hold that against Malik Willis by any stretch of the imagination. He's running the offense he's asked to run. But it just means there is a learning curve that's necessary for him when he gets to the NFL. So what teams need to do, so this gets into the next fascinating discussion with quarterbacks, Joe, is if you, for whatever reason, have to start him right away, you really have to limit your playbook with him, which then makes it easier for you to be defended by the opposing defenses. See, I'm not sure people think about those things. If you talk to coaches, they'll say, oh, we can only do these things right now.
Right.
And we hope as we do only those things that we're teaching him, and then we can expand on that as time goes by. But right now, this is all we can really do, and the defense is going to know that.
So in your evaluation, you leave that as an open-ended question. Because
yes,
there's
because
no way for you to know, right?
There's no way for me to know. I heard wonderful things about Malik Willis at the Combine, as far as his interviews, his personality, his intelligence. I heard wonderful things. But the reality is that he hasn't done those things. So it's an open question even for a team.
I want to take back, and you said earlier, the 30,000-foot approach. I want to take more of a 30,000-foot approach, because I remember you and we did a little fantasy points powwow a couple years ago.
Yep.
And the question of Kyler Murray came up, and I just asked you because I kind of knew what your answer was going to be, knowing you for over 10 years the way I have. When Kyler Murray came out of Oklahoma, you liked Kyler Murray, I asked you, Greg, and obviously he's shown some things in the NFL, but I asked you, Greg, flat out. I said, Greg, 5 years ago, would you have liked Kyler Murray as much as you did this year? And you said, no, I probably wouldn't have. So you're also adjusting that 30,000-foot approach, because what are some of the things that have changed in the NFL that might have surprised you, that lets you take a little bit of a different view on a prospect than you might have a few years ago?
Yeah, and that gets into the conversation about negotiables and non-negotiables at the quarterback position. Really tough to play quarterback in the NFL if you can't place the ball where you want to place it. You can do everything really well, Joe, but if you can't throw the ball where you want to, you have nothing.
Right.
So there's certain non-negotiables, and then there's other things that can change over time. And the reason it was a good point you brought up about Kyler Murray. I think it's been evident in the NFL over the last 5 years, and maybe even going back to some degree to Russell Wilson when he came in, which is more than 5 years ago, and you have to sort of adapt and and change with the times, is that height is no longer as big an issue in the equation as it once was.
Correct.
And I think NFL teams, NFL coaches, offensive coaches have understood and figured out ways where they can minimize the issue of lesser height. Now, it is an issue at times. I mean, I've spoken with coordinators who've worked with Russell Wilson, and they will say to me, hey, there are certain throws he can't make because he can't see it. So there are pros and cons. Obviously, Russell Wilson's a great player, so there's ways around it. And I think part of that, the second part of that equation, which certainly 15, 20 years ago would have not even been seen as something to discuss, is the second reaction improvisational play element. Yeah. The position's not taught that way. It never will be. And no coach in practice will roll out the ball and say, you know what, our game plan this week is we're going to have you run around. No coach would ever say that. But there's no question that element of the game has become more essential. Now, is it necessary? That's a big debate right now, even with coaches. I've talked to coaches about this. That's a big debate as to whether it's necessary or just something that we see more for any number of reasons. I mean, I know you could argue he's the greatest of all time, but obviously Tom Brady is very good without that element to his game. And you can't just simply say, Joe, well, he's Tom Brady, he's great.
Yeah.
You have to go through the process. Why is he great? Why does he not need that element to have reached the level that he's reached in the NFL? Can that still be done? Which brings up a quarterback like Carson Strong.
Exactly what I was thinking.
And again, he played with a big knee brace on his right knee this year. I don't know if that's an injury that will go away. It's like Davis Mills. His last year at Stanford, he wore a big knee brace. This year, he did not wear a knee brace. So I don't know what Carson Strong's situation is, but the tape tells you that he's a pocket player. Now, I think he's got some significant challenges because I don't think he's a great pocket player. Like if you think of great pocket quarterbacks over the years, you think of, let's say, a Carson Palmer. Carson Strong is not Carson Palmer. So the question is, can Carson Strong function effectively in the NFL? I would imagine that different coaches will see that differently, which is why when I do my transition, very rarely do I say a guy cannot play. or a guy's great. Every once in a while that happens, but there's too many variables. And I'm not sure a lot of people think about it that way, Joe. That's the thing. There's so many variables.
Mm-hmm. And Carson, just to bring up Carson Strong, and this is a hypothetical, Greg, but
right.
let's just say if he had maybe the second reaction ability, not of Malik Willis, but maybe even of somebody like Kenny Pickett, who can do that a little bit, he would probably be considered a higher level prospect in this class.
No question. I mean, here, great example, and I'll mention this because he's in the news. Who did Bruce Arians draft in the second round a year ago? Kyle Trask. Okay? Kyle Trask has almost no second reaction ability. Okay? But the way Bruce Arians sees the game, and no one can argue that he's not been a successful coach in this league for a long time, correct?
He's going to be in the Hall of Fame, I would guess.
Yeah, so he sees the quarterback position and the passing game a certain way. He might see it differently than others. But to him, Kyle Trask is the kind of quarterback that he would like to have, so he drafts him in the second round. Now, obviously, with Brady coming back, Trask will not play this year. But when Brady retired, Trask may have well been the starter this year. And you have to understand, with that style of quarterback, you have to do certain things that you're not going to do with Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson or Lamar Jackson or whoever else you'd like to name who falls into that other category we spoke about, or Malik Willis. So there's many ways. This is another thing I learned early on, is there's many ways to play, which is why the other reason my transitions, it's not a mathematical equation to me. It's not like saying 2 and 2 is 4. There's so many factors that go into play, and different coaches see things differently.
Yeah. I just think that's such a fascinating question. And I also want to throw a player out there who said, like, when you look at the college tape, like, a player can't get better in the NFL, because Josh Allen has certainly done that.
Right.
He's like the most explosive example, but there's guys who have done so as rookies. I think if you look at what Justin Herbert has done with the Chargers, it is preposterous that the Dolphins took Tua Tagovailoa over him. As a matter of fact, Greg, I think you can make the argument that if you redo that draft from a couple years ago, Justin Herbert should be the number 1 overall pick, despite what Joe Burrow has already done. But there were concerns about Justin Herbert coming out of Oregon, and he answered those concerns. But just to discuss how a quarterback can improve, and can improve quickly with coaching, what were some of the things that Justin Herbert had questions about coming out of Oregon that now he has answered in the affirmative in the NFL?
I think, Joe, that there were probably 2 questions about Herbert when he came out. And I think those 2 questions related to this. Number one, there was a sense that his ball placement, while not scattershot and erratic, was just not quite precise enough. I think that was one sense. And then the other thing about him was, and I thought this did show up on the tape, was the fact that he didn't seem to have a great feel for timing and anticipation. He struck me, and others felt the same way, by the way, that he was what we call a see it, throw it quarterback. But again, then you get into coaching. And, the Oregon offense, look, I'm not going to sit here and say anything negative about coaches, because I don't know how things are taught. So I don't go there. I don't have enough information to make that statement. But the point is you can help a quarterback with his timing and anticipation if you can do a really good job with your pass offense of defining the reads and the throws versus what you anticipate to be coverages based on your film study. So, and I think that's clear, that you can, if you, based on your film study, know that, hey, on first down, when we're in our base offense, we know we're going to get 1 of 2 coverages from the defense, which is normally the way it is in the NFL. Teams versus base offense don't play 8 coverages. They usually might play 2. Okay. So you can work around that, you know that. So you can help a quarterback. So were there things that were concerning to people? Absolutely. It's worked out. And my guess is he's not going to be going backwards at this point.
Right. And there comes in the interview process, the chalkboard process. It's possible, based on what we've seen recently from a guy like Herbert, that Malik Willis could come in and say, oh, yeah, I can do that. It just wasn't asked to do it at Liberty, which
That
is
correct.
Which is what makes him fascinating.
That is correct. And until coaches truly get a sense of working with him, you can put him on the board during an interview for an hour. That's fine. Yeah. But that's not the same as going to the OTAs and then being with him every day for 4 days and then getting a chance to work with him, in much greater detail. So you don't know that until you do all that. You get a sense and you might feel good about it if you're going to draft him. But, those things, they come about over time. Look, there's obviously quarterbacks who come in the league and play well early on, Joe. We know that. But if you speak to most coaches, they will tell you that it takes 3 to 4 years to really understand and fully grasp both all the details, nuances, and subtleties of your own offense and all those things in defenses that you're going to face in the NFL. Doesn't mean you can't play and you can't have success. We've seen a lot of quarterbacks do it, but it's how you do it then and what coaches have to do to allow you to do that. And it just takes time. I mean, it's, playing quarterback is really, really hard.
Yeah. And I want to ask about Kenny Pickett now because Mark Whipple was his offensive coordinator.
Yep.
At Pitt. He has a lot of, when I was working for the Eagles, he was on the Eagles coaching staff. He has a lot of time coaching in the NFL. Kenny Pickett, Greg, you're watching him on film and you're watching an offense that resembles an NFL offense, which probably makes your transition section a little bit of an easier task for you to write, would be my guess when it comes to somebody like Kenny Pickett.
Well, what you do, Joe, is you see things that I see when I watch NFL tape. I see route concepts that I see. Look, the kind of things you have to totally just ignore when you watch college tape. And I'm saying this honestly. Coaches will tell you this. Coaches have told me this, and it's 100% true. You're wasting your time if you're going to spend your time watching bubble screens and tunnel screens. You and I can throw those balls, Joe. That has nothing to do with whether a guy is going to transition well to the NFL. What you'd really like to see, beyond the obvious things of technique, fundamentals, don't forget, quarterback starts with that. You want to see a guy drop back. You want to see a guy drop back with a firm base, plant his back foot, be on balance, have a little knee bend, hold the ball in the right place, what we call ball carriage. You want to see these things, okay? Some guys do it, some guys don't. Then they get taught. People could think back to Aaron Rodgers coming out of Cal, playing for Jeff Tedford, right, where he held the ball literally up here, and that got changed in 5 minutes. No knock on Jeff Tedford, but I remember sitting and watching that with Ron Jaworski the year Rodgers came out, and Joe said to me, that'll be changed in 5 minutes, because you can't do anything athletically. Just if you put your arms up here, Joe, and try to do anything athletically, it doesn't work really well.
Greg, if I put my arms anywhere and try to do anything.
Right, well, me too, Scott. But the point being that, you want to see those things too, because that's where it starts when you coach a quarterback. Sometimes I feel like there's so much emphasis placed on scheme that people lose sight of doing things the right way. We mentioned, and I'll get back to what you said about Pickett, but I mentioned Tom Brady earlier. What's something that has been 100% true of Brady throughout his career, and one of the reasons he's Tom Brady? Repetitive mechanics. He does the same thing every time. How come Tom Brady doesn't need to make trick shot throws? It's a legitimate question.
Yeah. Right. And this is it's almost hard for me to answer because you said earlier, he's Tom Brady. No, well, if you're a coach, you have to
he wasn't Tom Brady.
Why is he Tom Brady?
He wasn't, I've talked with Charlie Weiss. He wasn't Tom Brady in 2002.
No. Even though he was starting at a decent level in the NFL, you look at Brady's numbers back then, right. And I know the game has changed, but he was a very good caretaker in a way, but he's not the guy who led the NFL passing this year.
How do you get there? And one reason, there's many, we're not going to get into Tom Brady now. We'll go back to Pickett in a sec here, but repetitive mechanics. That's important. Okay. So anyway, getting back to Pickett, one of the things you do see when you watch Pittsburgh offense, Pittsburgh passing game, is you see route concepts that I see every Sunday in the NFL. So he's been taught those. He's been taught the progression reads that go with those route concepts. So he has an understanding of that. So he comes into the NFL when it's a 3-by-1 set and they have a 3-man route concept and combination to the trip side, and then they've got the backside dig, which is very often the backside route. He knows, oh yeah, if I don't like what I have to trips, I know within the timing of my drop and my set that if I don't like the 3-man combination to the right, the dig now falls into that with timing. He knows this. You rarely see that in college football, but you saw it with Pitt because he was taught that. Now, does that mean he has nothing to work on? Of course not. I mean, if you see my evaluation, you'll see I had some weaknesses, and you'll even see that in my transition, I mentioned a couple of things. Yeah. But the point is, in that particular area of how he was taught route concepts, route combinations versus defense, he's going to be a step ahead of others.
And Greg, before we sign off here, just to ask about one more specific player, because I've really enjoyed having the kind of the bigger picture conversation here, but there are players who are interesting here. And I know it's a guy who you kind of like, and you're not saying he's a top 5 pick, and my guy Fran Duffy likes as well. And that's Desmond Ridder of Cincinnati. Yeah. And I thought it was interesting that you brought up Ridder, who is a very good athlete, by the way. But you brought him up just kind of an old school thing. Like Bill Parcells had a checklist.
Yep.
He was evaluating quarterbacks, and Ridder fits that checklist. And I think there's increasingly fewer guys every year who fit this Bill Parcells checklist.
Well, it's interesting. We mentioned Ridder off Pickett, who fit that checklist as well.
Interesting, yeah.
Ridder has some meaningful issues, which I put in my weaknesses, and people should look at those carefully because they're very meaningful. He has a little bit of an elongated delivery at times. Okay, so there's a lot of motion in his delivery, and that can negatively impact ball placement and velocity. And he does have a tendency at times to drop his arm angle just a bit. That also negatively impacts ball placement. And there's no question that Ridder, when you watch his tape in college, that he missed too many layups. He missed too many routine throws. That has to be cleaned up, and theoretically it can be. But just watching Ridder, first of all, you saw NFL throws, number one, and he played with such a refined sense and natural sense of poise and composure. That's not an X and O statement, Joe, but it just stood out. Nothing seemed to faze him. He was very comfortable playing within the confines of the pocket. And even though he is a good athlete and can run and make second reaction plays, he was not looking to do that. And there were times he showed really subtle and efficient pocket movement, which one could argue is a really important trait. Instead of just fleeing the pocket, because very often, and there's still no metric for this, Joe, analytics have become so big, but there's still no metric for throws that should be made that aren't made. Mm-hmm. And I see that all the time. Okay. And I take note of that all the time. And Ridder was very good in the pocket as far as staying and allowing things to happen. He did not flee the pocket. Too many quarterbacks do that. And yeah, can they run then for 12 yards and everybody goes, wow, they're mobile? Sure. But there is not a single coach who does not want the structure of the offense to work as designed. And I don't know if there'll ever be a metric for that. I mean, it seems like there's going to be a metric for everything somewhere down the road. But at this point, there is not a metric for throws that should be made that are not made.
And I want to look at that, from an NFL perspective, because you always tell the story is like, all right, what happens if let's just say Russell Wilson runs for 13 yards, and obviously he hasn't been doing that as much in recent years, but there was a 15-yard out pattern that he just didn't throw for some reason. Your question is always, what does the coach say on the sideline? Like, hey, great play, or
right,
miss the throw. And I think that's important because I'm just trying to get in the mindset of a coach here. Predictability.
I would think, Joe, that it's dependent on the coach.
Right.
My guess is Kyle Shanahan would say you got to throw it. And some other coaches, might say, depending on who the quarterback is, that's okay. But the first thing you'd want to know is why didn't you throw it? Okay, that's, I mean, obviously we're dealing with grown men. You don't, as a guy comes off the field, you don't yell at him. You want to know, hey, here was the route concept. The primary was there. Just tell me why you didn't make that throw. Now, if the quarterback says, hey, I didn't see it, there was a guy in my way, you're not going to yell at him or, get mad at him. But, look, I remember, and it's funny, I remember having a conversation with Kyle Shanahan at the Combine a number of years ago, and he was just talking about how I spend 16 hours a day putting together, my offense, my scheming, my plans, and I really would like my quarterback to execute it. And he wasn't saying it sarcastically.
Right.
That's the way coaches think. He's not the only one who thinks like that.
Well, I go back to you also saying, what is play calling in the NFL? Do you know exactly what a defense is going to do? My guess is
not. I would say you have a very good idea. There's not a lot of surprises. I had a great conversation 2 summers ago, the pandemic summer, with Carson Palmer. We spoke, and I've known Carson since he was a rookie, and we spoke on the phone for well over an hour and a half. And I asked him point blank, I said, as you got later in your career, were you ever surprised by anything the defense did? He said, maybe once every 6 or 7 weeks.
Yeah.
So you don't get surprised. Young quarterbacks get surprised. Veterans don't get surprised.
And that's why I bring it back to that, because you're essentially making a pretty good bet when you throw in a game plan, right? And if a quarterback doesn't make a throw that you game planned to be there, even if he runs for the first down, coaches want things to be predictable, don't they?
Correct.
Hey, let's just say, hey, Kenny Pickett, just to throw a name out there. Kenny, I designed this play for this situation. It was there. You didn't throw it this time. How do I know you're going to throw it the next time? That's kind of just how I'm thinking.
Well, think of it this way.
Yeah.
Even with great quarterbacks, think of Patrick Mahomes in the second half against Cincinnati, okay?
Yeah.
When he probably had the worst half of his career. And he's still a great quarterback. That's not the point. Right. But all of a sudden, he didn't execute the offense. And then look what happens. Yeah. At some point, you can't live on, as much as we like them, as much as we get excited by them. I mean, obviously Matthew Stafford made that great kind of no-look throw in the Super Bowl, which was a critical play. And Mahomes does that as well, maybe better than anybody right now. And certainly that has become sort of a foundation in some ways of his game. But then you get into a game in the AFC Championship game where the second half he just totally went outside of structure and it didn't work at all. It's easy to say, well, it's Mahomes, he's great. And he is great, but that's not the point. The point is they lost a chance to go to the Super Bowl because he did not play within the structure of the offense.
And there were throws there to be made.
Correct.
And so,
there's almost always throws there to be made, Joe, believe me.
Right. And by the way, the television angle, it's easy to say it. And you say this a lot, the offensive line was bad. He was getting pressured. But from the television angle, you can't see that his first and second throw were there. He just didn't throw it. And then therefore the pressure converges on the quarterback and it makes it look like the offensive line messed up.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. That happens a lot too, by the way. There's a big tendency, particularly with great quarterbacks like Mahomes, is when a throw is not made within structure to immediately assume that it was great coverage. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not.
Greg, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I like the bigger picture stuff.
Oh, so do I. I love this stuff, Joe. You know that.
But I do want everybody to know that there are very specific scouting reports for all the quarterbacks here. Greg, we're launching with 6, which I think everybody would consider the consensus top 6, which are Willis, in some order. Willis, Pickett, Corral, Sam Howell, Carson Strong, and Desmond Ridder.
Right.
We're launching with those. We're launching with 15 running backs, over 20 wide receivers, a good handful of tight ends. And then, Greg, we have some offensive linemen and some defensive players. But because we're a fantasy site, you got a lot of the skill position players to us first. There's going to be more coming in, especially on the defensive side of the football, throughout the month of April. Greg, you're continuing to grind away.
Yep.
And I just want everybody to know. By the way, Wes Huber has Devy prospects. Greg, I know you're a big Devy League guy.
I don't even know what that means, Joe.
It means you're drafting players who are still in college. So Wes Huber does that. So he's giving you scouting reports. Like, for instance, last year, Wes Huber had Breece Hall as his number 1 Devy running back. Greg, Breece Hall is a total package as a prospect.
I think Breece Hall's a really good prospect.
And we'll talk about him more. I think next week we'll talk running backs. But we're going to have a mock draft in there, which we're going to do throughout the month of April. But Greg, ultimately, you're the star of the show here for our prospect guide. Thank you for everything. We're launching with over 80 players today. We are going to have 150 plus. Wes is launching with 20 Devy prospects today. I think it's a great deal. We're going to have an app. It's going to look great on the website. Greg, just thanks for your time. We'll talk to you next week, and I'm looking forward to more prospects from you.
All right, Joe. Appreciate it.